I'll tell you what, if you will turn with me to Daniel 4. I'm going to put this in a perspective. I love how the Spirit of God will minister things. And it's going to begin with Daniel 4. I'm going to begin in verse 34. And at the end of the days, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. Babylon had a large percentage of the world under his power. This is a great king. It says, and at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and my understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. Nothing. And he does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? Amen. And you will see that here why we celebrate July 4th. I'm going to begin by telling you I've got some notes here in case I need them. Most time I don't. In about the 1720s to 1760s, we had a great revival in America. We called it the first Great Awakening. And we had people like Whitefield and who was the other one? Jonathan Edwards, that traveled all around the United States. Now remember, it was all by horse. There were no telephones, there were no computers, there were no TV sets. Everything was done by body. And they traveled around in the 13 colonies and they preached the gospel. If you look at some of their messages, they preached the gospel. Amen. And Ben Franklin, who really was an intellectual, was amazed at these speeches of Jonathan Edwards and Jonathan Edwards and Whitefield. He listened to him. In fact, Benjamin Franklin even wrote during that time, and I've shared it before, where he said he could walk the streets in these towns, not just one town, and he could hear, because of the open windows, people reading the Psalms out loud. Isn't that amazing? He said he could hear them reading the Psalms out loud. He was amazed. In fact, he even gave money to these guys because he knew that this was necessary. This was God. And that is what led to why you and I celebrate July 4th. First was the revival. Why? God moved in America. He moved in America, and he moved with that revival, and he moved on a small group of men. Amen. If you would just consider how few it took for America to become a nation, it took only a few. And it took a few that were led by the Spirit of God. It says that God rules in the kingdom of men, and he ruled here. So we had the First Continental Congress. We already had the Battle of Concord. We already had the Battle of Lexington. We already had Paul Revere's ride. We already had the shot heard round the world. That was in Concord. So we already had that. And so the First Continental Congress gets together and they start talking. Now you've got to realize that the First Continental Congress, they really didn't have a right to meet. These were British colonies under British rule under the King of England. But they met anyway. And the colonies sent delegates anyway. And they did it in danger of the king. Amen. But they got together and they said, we've got to do something. We were being taxed without representation. Our harbors, you couldn't trade with anybody but England. Amen. And then they taxed what you could trade with. So they were taking money from the colonists, and what they were doing with the money were they were having soldiers live in the colonies. So we were actually paying for our enemies to live with us, is what the Stamp Act and those things did. So we meet together. We don't want to go to war. But we have a man named John, it's funny, we have a man named John Adams. And everybody knew John Adams. And he was saying, look, this isn't going to work. War is inevitable. But we didn't want to go to war because, frankly, England was 10 times greater than we were. So we meet in the First Continental Congress, and we decide we're going to send a letter. I think the man's name was John Dickinson. He said, we're going to send a peace treaty to the king. And this was July 8th, 1775, a year before July 4th. So 1775, we do with the olive tree branch, is what we call it. And we send this document, this letter to the king. And we're asking him, let's reconcile. Let's get together and talk about this. Work with us here. If you'll just give us a little room, we won't try to get independence. All we want is taxation with representation, and we want the same laws that you give everybody in England.
Amen.
But an unusual, strange thing happened. That letter gets on its way to Britain. Remember, it's got to cross the ocean. That night, after they wrote that treaty, John Adams was completely against it. And there were some others that weren't sure. But they thought, we've got to try it. We don't want a bunch of dead people. But John Adams goes home that night and he writes a letter to a friend, just a friend. And in the letter he says, this war is inevitable. He said, this is not going to work. He said, we're going to go to war. He said, I don't know why we haven't even started making a navy yet. Why we haven't been working on an army. And he writes this in a letter to his friend. So the olive branch heads off to Britain, and he sends the letter to his friends. Well, that letter got intercepted by the British. And they read it. And they take it to England. And the king gets word of the letter that John Adams wrote before he even hears of the olive branch treaty. And so the king says, well, they're going to war. And they come in and they say, well, we got this olive branch thing. And you know what? The king of England wouldn't even look at it. Wouldn't even look at it. Why? Because of a letter intercepted from John Adams. Wouldn't even look at the document. He starts an army. He starts sending the army over here. So we realize that doesn't work. That's not going to work. So a year later, we get together on July 2nd, 1776. And we decide we've got to write a declaration of separation from the king. War is inevitable. The king decided that war was inevitable. We didn't. The king did. And he said that the colonies were in rebellion, and so he can send his army. So we meet July 2nd, the Second Continental Congress. They meet under wraps. They don't want to be caught. If they're caught, they're all dead. They're all dead. This is a small group of men, about 50, meeting. And if they get caught, they're dead. They all get hung. So now they meet July 2nd. And they start talking about independence. Now they've got delegates from every colony. They've got 13 colonies. We've got delegates from every colony. They know that these colonies, if we're going to vote for war, it's going to have to be unanimous. It's going to have to be. You can't go to war with an army that's 10 times your size. 10 times your size. Coming, they're on the water. In fact, when they are working on this, there's 100 British ships getting ready to go into New York Harbor. They're pulling into the harbor as they're talking. 100 of them. You know how many the colonists had back in 1776? 5 or 6. 5 or 6 ships. They didn't have a navy. And you got 100 British ships pulling into the harbor. And you're in Philadelphia, and you're going to decide that this little group of people are going to pull away from the King of England, knowing what's coming at you. But they did it anyway. Why? They had a spirit in them, pushing them. So they meet. John Adams that day he debates. They debate. John Adams gets up to give a speech. He said that when he finished, he spoke for several hours. They had 8 hours they debated over this. John Adams spoke for 2. And at the end of the debate, there were 3 delegates missing. But they were going to vote at that day. And so he goes through 2 hours, no notes. He's just talking from the heart. And when he finishes, he says, that's the best speech I have ever given. In fact, in the middle of it, they had a guy from North Carolina. I think his name was Hoke or something like that. He was a delegate from South Carolina. And he was ardently against it. We're not going to war. No, we're not going to commit. I mean, he was ardently against it. And in the middle of that speech, he stands up and he goes, I give up, I give up, I give up. He said, we'll do it, we'll do it.
Amen.
Now, this man represents all of Delaware. I mean, all of South Carolina. So he's saying South Carolina's with us with that one statement. So they finish. John Adams finishes. 3 delegates come in late. They show up late. And they asked John Adams, everybody's talking about John Adams' speech. They said, well, could you do it again? Can you do it again? He did it again. And at the end of that speech, they voted. Now, they tallied the votes. The vote was 9. I think this was on the 1st of July. The vote was 9 for writing a declaration, 3 against. You can't go to war with England 9-3 because every state has got to be with you. Why? Because they've got to send an army. They've got to make a navy. We didn't have a navy. They're going to have to find ships. They're going to have to find sailors. They're going to have to find people to fight in the war. They're going to have to find militia. They don't have any of this. Just the militias in the states just to protect the cities. So what did they do? They sit down. They realize, we're going to take the vote again tomorrow. We're going to vote tomorrow. John Adams goes home that night and he realizes that vote tomorrow is going to decide. It's going to decide the fate, not just of the country, of everybody that lives in the United States. Because they have a choice. They're either going to live under tyranny, or they're going to go to war. Either way, it's not good. So you have a choice. You're either going to stay in tyranny. You know, we housed the British Army. That means that if you had a 3-bedroom home, they're going to give you 6 soldiers and you're going to have to feed them, clothe them, and give them your bedrooms. That's what we were doing. So now we got to decide, do we want to keep doing that? Or are we going to fight? You know what caused that ability to stand up? The Spirit of God. The Spirit of God. So the next day they meet, it's got to be unanimous. They get ready to take a vote. It goes down to the 3 against. The 3 against, I believe it was Delaware, had 3 delegates. The 2 came the day before. 1 was for war, the other was against. You needed the 3rd. They closed the doors at 9. Right after they closed the doors, here comes the 3rd delegate from Delaware. And as they said, he walked in booted and spurred. He had a scarf around his face. Why? He had cancer on the face. He's covered in a scarf. He shows up, he votes for. So now Delaware is for. South Carolina, the guy that stood up and said, I give up, I give up, I give up. There's only 1 delegate. 4. Now we're down to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had 7 delegates. They had 4 against, 3 for the war. That day, because they knew what it was going to take, and because they knew what lay ahead for this nation, 2 of those delegates against didn't show. Amen. They didn't come. They didn't come. They saw what was happening, and they knew if they came, it would not be unanimous. They didn't come. So that made 2-3, Pennsylvania 4. New York had to abstain because they had no representation. They didn't know New York, the delegation from New York didn't know what New York wanted. They weren't given any decision, so they had to abstain. So now you have a unanimous vote. They vote on July 2nd. 2 days they have to write the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson writes, he has some help from John Adams. Thomas Jefferson does it in a night. Have you ever read that document? I have it on my website, on my Facebook. You ought to read it. If you can't see the Spirit of God in the words that Thomas Jefferson wrote and John Adams went, they wrote the document. The next day they made some changes, but it was a list of grievances. And why? Why? When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary. It becomes necessary. Do you know that most of the colonies at that time, the majority of the people were moderate? They didn't want to go to war.
Amen.
But you've got a delegation here deciding the fate. 56 people deciding the fate of a whole nation. A whole nation. 56 people. Do you see the wisdom of God? Do you see how God wrote that document? Do you know they signed it on July 4th, and that's the day that we celebrate. That's the day that they published it. They read it. They read it to the group of people that were meeting outside. We went to war with a country that had 10 times the army and the ammunition and the power that we had. We had. But what did we have with us? We had God. If you ever can see Gideon's army in this, that's what it was. It was Gideon's army. When we needed help from God, he helped. He brought in tornadoes. He brought in fog. He brought in all these natural elements to stop the British Army from conquering the colonies. That's what the Spirit of God did. That's what we celebrate. Do you know that your ability to go out and protest, like we have been in these United States, all started with this document, which you celebrate today? That flag that you burn, you're allowed to burn it because it started with this document. You couldn't do that with the King of England. You know, our being able to come to Water of Life and not the state-run church started with that document. Because in England, you had to go to the Church of England. It started with this document that God had a group of men write using his words. Some of the words about I think I've got it written here. But some of the words in that, no, I don't. But some of those words that we have rights born with us. Where did they come from? The Declaration of Independence tells you where they come from. They come from the Creator.
Amen.
Your rights to be equal, to have life, the pursuit of happiness comes from your Creator. You don't see the kingdom of God in this? Do you know why America is such a great nation?
Amen.
Because the kingdom of God is here. Not because of men, not because of money, not because of materials. You got countries all over the world that have many more natural materials than we do. But why? Because we've got the kingdom of God here. Why do our fields make so many bountiful harvests? Because the kingdom of God is here. Because the kingdom of God is here. Why did America win a war that was much, much greater against them? Because the kingdom of God was here. Why did we make it through the Civil War all together? The kingdom of God was here. Why did we go through World War I still together and never an army within our borders, never an army coming in our borders? Have you ever considered that? We have never been invaded.
Amen.
Why? The kingdom of God is here.
Amen.
That's why we have the hand of God on this nation. And God have mercy on us that we remember that we keep that we worship and praise the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so the kingdom stays here.